Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the New Covenant Group's Monday night Humanist Matters with Dr. John R. Shook, which we'll be turning over to him momentarily. Tonight's topic is a very interesting one that I think is going to stimulate a lot of conversation, and that is, should chimps be given human status? Which is a very broad topic, which I think is going to lead us into a lot of um, other topics that we can start getting into after that. So, without any further ado, let me turn that over to Dr. John Ashok. But one more thing, if you do have any questions, comments, anything like that, we will be reading those in the last half of the show. So feel free to leave them in the comments. We are watching them, or I am watching them right now, and we will then turn it right over to John R. Shook. Let's go to him now. How you doing?
Are you doing, Sean?
I'm doing good. How about yourself?
Great.
All
So,
right.
welcome to Humanist Matters. As advertised, this is Dr. John Shook, professor at the University of Buffalo, and I'm involved with the Science in the Public Master's Program, an entirely online program, and also freelance philosopher working in the humanist movement. And I'm proud to have this show on the New Covenant Group, where atheists and theists and everybody in between can come together and talk about hot topics that matter to us and matter to the world. And tonight's topic might even matter to chimpanzees. If there are any tuning in tonight, welcome. For the humans, welcome also. And I picked this topic because I thought that we'd have an opportunity to really get into some of the nuts and bolts about this philosophy, this ethics, this worldview that has been called humanism. And every show we try to explore one angle or another. Tonight we're getting into the non human world and we're asking questions about how we treat animals and how we can treat them better and what legal protections might be useful for protecting chimpanzees better. So I hope you'll enjoy this exploration with me tonight. I'll be delighted in taking questions that are posted on the website, passed along through Sean, and he'll probably throw in a couple questions of his own. At least I hope so. So let's get started. This topic you may have seen erupted suddenly when an animal rights activism organization filed suit in New York State, attempting to request of a judge in a court there to declare that chimpanzees are persons. Now, obviously, this legal effort is trying to protect chimpanzees that happen to be in the state of New York, for that's where the suit was filed, with better protection from mistreatment, from enclosures that aren't appropriate for primates, from any sort of cruelty, intended or unintended. And when we try to legally protect animals, in a sense, we're giving them rights, legal rights, of the sort that would be enough to actually protect them against mistreatment by human beings. So we can call those rights, we could call them protection rights, just as a handy label to distinguish them from other kinds of rights. Rights like, for example, civil rights, where people have the right to participate in government, have rights that protect them from government action. But tonight we're talking not about chimpanzees being allowed to vote or enjoy due process under the law, but from something simpler and perhaps even more important, protection just from cruelty and domination by all of humanity. And in the legal world, it could be a very useful, could call it a shortcut, a legal shortcut. Because if chimpanzees could be declared as persons legally, then one would expect that rights would enjoy the very highest level of protection, and people that enjoy those kinds of very high levels of legal protection can enjoy all sorts of other protections as well. So, for example, the government can arrest people who are mistreating animals with those protection rights. If they're persons, then indeed the punishments could be severe, perhaps as high as if one human being is harming, injuring another human being. And maybe that's the point of trying to assign personhood, because that would create a legal status so high that presumably harming a chimpanzee in some way, that if you did that to another person, then the two punishments, one would think, ought to be the same. We're talking about equality here, full equality in some sense. Because if chimpanzees were declared persons, then they would enjoy equal levels of protection to humanity. The murder of a chimpanzee would have to be treated the same as the murder of any other human being. I take it that's rather the point of personhood. There's a great deal at stake here about personhood. It is the case that assigning personhood to chimps would be an extraordinary level of protection. It's really the sort of highest level of protection that legal structures could possibly give. That's rather the point of the label of personhood. It's part of the quest for human equality. The word personhood was used some in the 18th century, more and more in the 19th century, and has been the term of choice, I think, in the 20th century as a powerful symbol for those advocating an ethical ideal of the full equality of every human being, just simply in virtue of the fact that they are a human being. That's why, of course, the word person and assigning personhood becomes so contentious. For example, it's not a coincidence that when pro-life advocates wanting to protect human fetuses in the womb from abortion make their case for personhood for embryos, fetuses inside the womb, perhaps all the way back to the moment of conception. For you see, the logic is pretty simple. If fetuses are persons and persons enjoy the full equal protection under the law that any other human being enjoys, therefore, there would be serious legal consequences concerning abortion. Abortion would, in fact, be the murder of a person, hence the rest of the legal machinery would follow, and that's, of course, what anti-abortionists want. So there's a great deal riding on assigning personhood. But so far what I've been emphasizing is that the word person, the legal status of personhood, is a tool, and that tool has been designed to try to extend equality for all humanity. It's a very human-centric term. It tries to identify who is most like us and include them as us. Excluded groups in the past haven't been treated as persons. The fight to expand the circle of those included in personhood is the struggle to try to make all human beings truly equal, at least in the eyes of the law and hopefully in our hearts as well. Great deal of riding on chimpanzees. Now, what does this all have to do with humanism? Well, humanism is a philosophy. It's an ethics specifically. And by ethics, we mean not just having a morality and trying to be moral the way we were raised, the way our culture teaches us, the way our hearts call us. Ethics involves more reflection. And ethics is the effort to prioritize the most important moral responsibilities and duties that we can have. So when you do ethics, you may decide that the morality you learned from your culture needs upgrading. It needs adjustment. It needs some reprioritization. You may have learned things from other cultures that tell you that some things that your culture says are okay really maybe aren't okay. Or on philosophical reflection, you may say, well, no culture really prioritizes our moral responsibilities quite right. We need to do it with some abstract thought rather than relying on any particular culture. So ethics happens when we're dissatisfied with the morality that we've been relying on so far, whether it be our intuitions, our heartfelt compassions, the moral instruction that we got during childhood, the things that culture continually indoctrinates us into. So ethics is about responsibility, taking responsibility for controlling and adjusting morality as needed, treating morality as something that we can always learn more about. So what can we learn from humanism? Well, humanism, as we talk about in other shows, and we'll keep repeating, and I'll say in this show again, humanism is about making sure that human beings take responsibility themselves for figuring out what the best morality is, or at least the better morality, reprioritizing where necessary, and trying to make sure that all of humanity follows the best morality that we can judge. It's something that never quite stays the same, but better ways of living are always supposed to be pursued, and we have to take responsibility for that. What gets ruled out? Well, any religion or ideology that instead says that human beings aren't ultimately responsible for morality or for adjusting morality or even for thinking about morality. Now, it is the case that humanism does say and has said in manifestos and mottos that human beings are responsible for ethics. Could other animals be responsible for ethics as well? Well, they would have to be extremely intelligent animals, as at least intelligent as human beings. No other species that we know of either does ethics or works at ethics. There is morality of a sort to be found across many, many other species. Many varieties of mammals, especially the primates, seem to do very morality-like behaviors. Perhaps we needn't try to find the same morality across even primates, but there are similarities, family resemblances, perhaps, to use an evolutionary phrase. Even though we can find, for example, things like chimp morality, orangutan morality, perhaps gorilla morality, and so forth, that doesn't mean that they have to do it the same way we do. We wouldn't expect them to do fully human morality. We live in ways that they don't try to. But what is clear is that they aren't doing ethics. Only humanity is doing ethics on this planet. We do in virtue of the fact that we use sophisticated language. We endlessly deliberate about what we're doing in societies, and we work hard at changing over time, in fits and starts, our moralities to try to do better and take more responsibility. The other primates, to the extent that they do morality, are content to just keep doing whatever morality they happen to evolve. Humanity is burdened with having to take responsibility for what has been handed to us by evolution and trying to thoughtfully make it better. So that's the difference between morality and ethics. Humanism is not just a list of moral principles, but there are explanations why those ought to be the highest principles. There's some ethical thinking there. So asking whether chimps could be persons calls for deep ethical thinking, and because humanism offers its efforts, humanism does have to consider this question. But this humanist has a warning. I don't know whether chimps are persons, as a philosopher, I really enjoy the question because it perhaps steers us towards asking the right questions. Here's one question to provoke some thought. If we're going to assign personhood to animals that are not human beings because they aren't human, in other words, if we're interested in using personhood as somehow a way to get beyond continually prioritizing human beings, what human beings are like, sameness to humanity, then why would we select species as candidates for personhood that are the most closely similar to humanity? I mean, if you were serious about the quest for assigning personhood to animals, if you were serious about getting over using humanity as the standard, then the last species you would pick is the species most similar to humanity and the species that we feel we have the most in common with. That's a curious thing. Why not snakes? I mean, if you were serious about picking species that didn't have to have some shared core or essence to humanity, snakes would do it. Now, there are snake lovers out there who think that their snakes have personalities and really enjoy their human companions. Maybe. But nevertheless, the dissimilarities are strong. So, why chimps? Well, I think there's a very simple answer why chimps. It's, let's face it, not about our heads, but about our hearts. Chimps really are like us. I mean, it's beyond just being cute and great companions if you can get one to get along with you. Uh, they really are very much like humanity. There's a reason, evolutionary speaking, why they are cousins to Homo sapiens, us. And I think this appeals to our heart. And that's operating at a moral level, not at an intellectual ethics level. At the moral level, it's easier to feel compassion for those who are like us. And the more that they are like us, the easier it is for us to empathize with them, take an interest in their welfare, perhaps even be very compassionate towards them, compassionate to a level that we would want them as well treated as any human being should be treated. But this is a very emotional response, and that's where morality primarily lives, at the emotional level. So to conclude my reflections for now, and perhaps Sean is ready for a question himself, or perhaps there's already a comment or two coming in, let me just say that there's a bit of a paradox, and philosophers love paradoxes, but this one we have to take all very seriously. There's a bit of a paradox on the one hand of saying we need a concept like personhood to get over thinking that human beings and what human beings are like determines whether or not there is protection. Versus, and here's the tension, if you really want to get beyond only thinking about what human beings are like and what is essential to us, why would you pick primates as your number one candidates for personhood, right? There's a real tension there. And furthermore, if you're prepared to declare chimps as persons, who's next? Are horses persons? Are there enough similarities between people and horses, or between chimps and horses? Where do you draw the line? Where does it stop? Perhaps we wouldn't be able to find out. Perhaps personhood would get extended too far, not become particularly useful. That could happen. That could happen. Or maybe there's a principled way to draw the line. I'm not sure about that. I haven't seen the line drawn very well quite yet. Sean, how we doing? Have we got any comments, questions so far? I should wind down here for a minute.
We have a few people in the chat here that suggested also elephants, dolphins, and orcas. But my question, excuse me, my question would be, would all of this not wanting to give them personhood be thrown out the window if somehow we came across maybe just one chimp that was able to speak?
We do think that language, speaking, being able to voice oneself, being able to have an individual personality is something very important to what it means to be human. And if you're looking for that in other animals, wouldn't it be delightful if there were some super smart chimpanzees that could do more than some sign language, could do more than just the simple manners of chimpanzee communication, and really talk to us? That would be remarkable. Probably won't happen very quickly, but if there were some chimps, uh, genetically engineered super chimps, I'm thinking of a couple of science fiction movies. Perhaps they could very eloquently speak on behalf of their species. And in fact, at the moral level, this has always been very powerful because human beings that could stand up, speak for themselves, speak forthrightly, be persuasive, be sympathetic figures have always been the most powerful spokespeople for their disadvantaged portion of humanity. One thinks, for example, of eloquent intellectuals found among races, for example, that have been treated as less than human, or women, for example, who have suffered under paternalism. And we've, as a species, been gradually able to recognize them as persons precisely because they have not just personality, but individuality and autonomy. And we can recognize this most easily when they can speak up and prove that they are thoughtful individuals with their own perspectives and ideas and principles. Yeah, it would be great if some chimpanzees could do this. But of course, we're still going back to the same tension, the same trap that I was pointing to earlier. Is this really what personhood is about? Just having respect for those most like us? I think advocates for personhood really are trying to not use what humanity does as the criteria for what deserves respect and protection. So, how do you stop looking for things that human beings already do? Well, that's hard. I certainly don't have the answer to that.
Do you? Let me think. It almost seems kind of like a little conundrum, given that chimpanzees, or more specifically bonobos, are our closest ancestral um, relationship. It almost sounds like it's forcing people to say, yes, we are direct descendants due to evolutionary biology, our DNA and everything, but when it comes to giving, it's hard to say equal rights, because I wouldn't say that a chimp needs the right to remain silent, or basic things like that. But it's almost like saying they're close, but wait a second, not that close, not that close. So it's kind of like um, picking and choosing. Um, I'm trying to think of a better way to articulate this. Is uh, it's like you're close because of just how the DNA is, but you're not close enough to us not do testing on you, basically. And I think isn't that what this all boils down to? Really, is just animal rights and not doing testing on them. Is that kind of the foundation of this whole lawsuit?
I think morality and compassion is really the engine, which makes all kinds of sense. I mean, that's really the basis for our moral energy, and that's a good thing. You don't need sophisticated intellectual ethics. Sometimes that just gets in the way. Sometimes that gets in the way of just doing what your gut instinct tells you is the right thing to do. And if your gut instincts is arousing compassion in you, is arousing a determination to do everything you can to help protect animals from cruelty and domination, then that is probably good enough for you. The rest is just technical detail, whatever machinery you need in order to make that a legal reality, including coming up with some technical legal definition for personhood in order to get the job done. And I suspect, aside from a few gestures at autonomy or individuality or high intelligence, animal activists don't really, why would they put much work into convoluted philosophical definitions for personhood or for individuality or autonomy or whatever else they're trying to do? I think ultimately they're trying to appeal to other people's sense of compassion, sense of fairness, sense that other animals ought to be able to flourish on their own without being dominated and cruelly used by humanity. So moral energy is a good thing. In legal courts, though, it's not enough. You also need a good argument. So that's where a lot of the tension, I think, is coming from.
Where do you think, I mean, just hypothetically speaking, if they were to get personhood status, um, what do you see that could lead to? I mean, do you see there being all kinds of like opening up a Pandora's box of problems, or just hypothetically thinking about it? Let's say that we uh, gave them personhood. What do you think would happen?
Well, I think a lot would happen. This is a huge hypothetical because, of course, it would, if taken seriously, have to be argued all the way up to the Supreme Court, just as the Supreme Court has been invited to decide that all fetuses in the womb are persons. So far, the Supreme Court has declined the opportunity to declare that fetuses are full persons in the eyes of the law and the Constitution. Instead, the Supreme Court, from Roe v. Wade back in 1973 on down to the present, so far, has been content to say that in legal matters, the Constitution says that full legal status, uh, personhood, so to speak, is only for human beings, and specifically equal protection under the law in the United States means that you have to be born or naturalized. That means you have to be a human being born and naturalized. So it's doubtful how far this could get. But I mean, right, let's suppose the hypothetical, suppose it makes it past the Supreme Court, sure. I mean, not too many people thought the corporations would be declared as persons, but that happened by this Supreme Court. So chimps are persons. Well, lots of things would start to happen right away. For example, the UN Charter on Human Rights gives a lot of rights to those given full equality as human persons. One, for example, is the right to freely travel. Should chimps have the right to freely travel?
Yes.
Well, I mean, it's
Yes.
one thing to say that they shouldn't be cruelly kept in small cages. It's quite another to say that they ought to be able to roam the countryside as they see fit without barriers. Right?
That would
There's a
be
big
awesome.
difference.
That would be awesome.
It would be amazing to just have roaming tribes of chimpanzees crossing borders, not needing identifying papers, just allow them to immigrate wherever they want. But in practical terms, of course, this won't ever happen. We'll continue to restrain them and try to keep them on nature preserves and so forth. So, in effect, you would end up with, well, among human beings, we call it keeping them on their reservation or apartheid or other forms of territorial segregation because we won't as a practical matter be allowing chimps just to roam wherever they like. So it's hard to see why we would actually extend additional personhood rights after declaring them persons. We'd not only we'd vault right past a tension and a conundrum right into pure hypocrisy. Because if you go down the list of rights attached to persons, either by international treaty, something like the United Nations, or constitutions of republics like the United States, there are all sorts of rights, and we aren't going to be giving them to chimpanzees. We just aren't, because they're not either interested, capable, or really responsible in the ways that we expect of persons. And that's, of course, why legally we've always used protection rights rather than full personhood rights for animals. If you don't want certain bad things happening to animals, you can still pass laws. You can award them protection rights where laws say these animals are protected. You can't do X, Y, and Z. And if you're worried about other things, then you add them legally as well. So you create strict boundaries on what can be done to chimpanzees or to other animals. Protection rights would be robust enough. We wouldn't have to resort to personhood despite the claims made by animal rights activists. It just isn't true that the only legal remedy, the only legal instrument is to assign personhood. We would just need more robust protection rights.
It would kind of take away from what personhood is, wouldn't it? A little bit if you start
Well,
including.
and now you're quite right. I mean, that's the dark side of this paradox. So for example, suppose it turns out that after awarding chimps personhood, they really only effectively, practically, can have, let's say, rights A, B, and C. Great rights, they're protected against human domination, against cruelty, against restraint. They're free to roam wild on vast territories they can call their own, right? Sort of the ideal vision. But that means that a long list of other very important personhood rights either aren't allowed to apply or just would be ridiculous to try to apply to them, which means in effect you've now diluted the whole point of having personhood. And in fact, there could be a real problem for us human beings. In other words, suppose a country argued, we don't need to give all these rights to the human persons living in our borders. Look at chimps. Chimps only have rights A, B, and C because they're persons. Those are the only rights we're interested in giving to human beings within our borders, and you can't call us hypocrites or violators of international treaty because we're treating human beings the same as you want to treat chimps. Right? Oh boy, that's not good. Personhood is a very high standard, the highest standard that we can apply to human beings. If there's no way to practically treat non human animals in the same way, I can't, in good conscience, recommend dramatically changing the meaning of personhood that much. Don't mess with personhood. It's too valuable. Too much has been fought for establishing this high ideal of personhood for humanity. The last thing we want to do is dilute it and somehow harm humanity in the process. There must be a win-win solution here somewhere. I hope there is.
And let me just read from the comments here. It says, I don't know why something would have to be classified as human, excuse me, or human-like in order for it to be considered valuable or worthy of protection. Also, it goes on to say that there has to be a place on the spectrum between pets are considered property and considered human or human-like. Also, there is a Travis Sherwood wrote here. I believe that all animals are capable of compassion, but empathy. But that being said, all animals are also capable of violent acts as well as people. The only difference is people can determine when when they have done something wrong, and can be stopped effectively or efficiently. Sorry. Whereas a chimp, question mark. Have you not seen the reports of crazy chimps?
Sure, sure. I'm in sympathy with those comments. I think they continue to point to the problem of misusing a concept like personhood. Perhaps we need a different term. Language fails us here. It fails us because, of course, for the last 3 centuries, we've been working very hard, and rightly so, on just trying to get all of humanity respected with equal moral worth, equal dignity, equal protection under the same laws for everybody. We've been expanding the circle to include the whole species. Extremely important. But of course, that battle was all about us. It was about protecting humanity from itself, which meant that you had to emphasize what was common to all humanity. Well, that means, of course, then that you have a very species centric project and a very species centric definition, both for humanity and for personhood. It's a tool, but it's a limited tool, only good for so much. So that's why I think that many environmentalists, many animal rights activists, it really can't be about trying to decide that non human animals are really human. Kind of sounds weird, kind of sounds counterproductive. It certainly isn't consistent with biology. There is a point to classifying other species as other species, right? As not human. Furthermore, if we're ever going to get beyond putting humanity first, putting what is essential to human beings first, using what we are like as the standard for what deserves respect and protection, if we're going to get beyond that, we need ethical criteria that don't start from the things we like most about ourselves. What do we like most about ourselves? Well, we think we're a terribly clever species. We're certainly a talkative species. There are noble things about us. We strive for individuality. We strive for autonomy. These are things that a very social animal with a very large brain can strive for. Other animals, that's not their environmental niche. That wasn't their evolutionary destiny. That doesn't mean they're not worthy of respect and protection, of course. So if compassion is going to lead the way, what that means is that we have to expand our hearts to appreciate other species for what they are, not for the degree of similarity to us. And that is a completely different ethical project than the one that has been pursued during the last 3 centuries by Enlightenment efforts to expand the circle of equality to include all of humanity. A noble project had to be done, essential to democracy, essential to the pursuit of peace and the ending of wars and violence. But of course, that's not the only valuable project on this planet. And we don't have to feel like we have to treat all the other important ethical projects on this planet the same way that we treated this problem of trying to strive for equal rights among human beings. Philosophically, it's probably a mistake to assume that one tool solves all problems. So I think we need more creative philosophical and scientific thinking to come up with ethical standards so that we can rely on compassion and a kind of an understanding of other species for what they are in themselves. And that is a huge, huge challenge. Instead of worrying about how much they are like to us, we just simply have to wonder what it's like to be them. That's a big challenge, but I think we had better confront it.
And someone else wrote in the chat here that I guess a similar type of bill was tried to pass in 2008, where they were trying to give similar rights to whales in a 5-4 decision, ruling the Navy could test sonar to determine whales, or at the detriment of whales. Sorry.
Yeah,
Um,
they were using powerful underground sonar, which may have been um, destroying the ability of whales to hear. Like sitting next to a jet engine.
yeah, I guess the what's in quotes, it says the balance of equities and the public interest tip strongly in favor of the Navy. So, also in the chat, we were talking, or someone was talking about how when personhood is given to a embryo, which I would guess that this is most likely the logical place that this conversation would go to is people would want to know, um, when do you grant personhood to an actual human being? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, this gets back to the problem of where do you draw the line? If you actually try to have some objective criteria, those criteria could get you in trouble. So you have to sort of do thought experiments, quick check, at, am I drawing the line in the right place? Here's a problem. If all chimpanzees are persons, right? Then presumably a newborn chimpanzee would be a person. Okay. But if it's really about similarities to humanity, if it's really about the capacities of chimpanzees that they share with us, what is it about a baby chimpanzee? Well, it's not just that it's cute. It's got the potential for an impressive level of intelligence. It already has a sophisticated brain. I mean, in the mammalian world, a baby chimpanzee has, impressive cognitive capacity already. But here's a question for you. If a baby chimpanzee is a person in virtue of its cognitive capacity and potential for development, wouldn't, let us say, a 7-month-old human fetus still in the womb have as much or even more cognitive development and potential as a baby chimpanzee? Well, that's a stretch of the imagination, but you see why I'm offering up the comparison. Um, 7-month-old fetuses, a lot of brain development. In fact, a prematurely born 7-month fetus, now a baby, if it's a preemie, can survive. Many of them, most of them do now with the impressive technologies available. Certainly more cognitive development and potential than just a baby chimpanzee. So if baby chimpanzees are in, then it would seem that 7-month fetuses are in, and now you've just declared many fetuses in human wombs as persons. This would delight the anti-abortion crowd. I think it would surprise a lot of other people. But you see, it illustrates the difficulties drawing the line. Maybe the line has been drawn too far so that you've included too much. Another way of thinking about this is if a baby chimpanzee is in, what about a fully grown adult grizzly bear? Uh, Adult grizzly bears are highly intelligent, very capable, very autonomous, far more so than a newborn chimpanzee. So bears are in. And if bears are in, where does it stop? Surely wolves, horses, pigs, right? I mean, so now simply by declaring chimpanzees as persons and using criteria that a baby chimpanzee can fulfill, logically you now have to include within personhood, about 800 species of mammals minimum as persons, equal. to human beings and deserving the same legal protections. Yeah, that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Surely there must be some other way out of this conundrum.
Okay, we've got, and maybe this might not be your department or not, but who decides about which species gets more rights? And then the person also says that discrimination against animals. Whoops, hold on, it just moved. Discrimination against animals on the basis of species is akin to racism or sexism. What do you think?
Uh, Interesting comments. They point to more conundrums and problems that we aren't going to solve anytime soon. Philosophers certainly don't have the answers. Um, Read back the first one again, would you, Sean? The first part?
It says who decides about
Oh, who decides? Right, right,
right.
right. Well, according to humanism, we do. That is to say, humanity, because we're the only species on the planet capable of doing ethics. And according to humanism, we have to take responsibility for restraining and controlling our own behavior. So it's you and I and everyone else that ought to take a close look at species, try to compassionately understand them for what they are instead of constantly comparing them to us, and seeing if that moral energy can be aroused to at least make us try to protect them by whatever legal machinery seems appropriate and sensible. So, according to humanism, we decide, and why? Because we must. There is no God that's going to tell us. There's no ancient scripture, certainly no political ideology that I would care to trust. Uh, it's going to come down to us together trying to figure out the best way forward together. And remind me of the second part of that, Sean.
Is basically what it was getting down to is that by giving one, I'll read the second part again here. Discrimination against animals
Oh, is it like racism? Yeah,
is
well, look,
yeah.
you can only decide where discrimination is happening after you've drawn the line deciding who deserves equality. In other words, once you know who deserves equality, then anybody who's in that isn't receiving what is due to them, that would be inappropriate discrimination, perhaps deserving of legal action. But of course, that presumes we know who's in. Right now, according to civilized legal standards, all of humanity's in. So discrimination against some portion, some segment of humanity certainly is discrimination and should be looked into and remedied. You can't declare discrimination against other species unless you know whether or not they're in. And that's precisely the question, the issue, the problem that is under discussion. We don't know if it's inappropriate discrimination. We haven't decided. We don't know. That's what the argument is about. If we do decide that chimpanzees ought to, in some sense, be in our club, then failure to appropriately protect chimpanzees would be discrimination because we've already included them. We haven't already included cows, so you can't discriminate against cows. Now, you could get frustrated with this and say, no, dang it, I want to know which species we're discriminating against right now. Well, the correct answer is, of course, all of them. I mean, as a practical matter, we're discriminating against all species. We're not very good at treating equally all humanity yet, even though our ideals are trying to make us do so. And we are treating non human animals in all sorts of terribly cruel and domineering and, in a way, unfair ways. Uh, I mean, but again, where do you draw the line? Which species are in and which species are out? And can you explain the criteria that you're using? That's the philosophical question. And I don't think it's going to be solved by some sort of legalistic shortcut. Even if some judge declared chimps are persons, animal rights activists might jump for joy. The rest of us are going to scratch our heads. Many of us are going to disagree, just as many of us aren't terribly impressed by one Supreme Court by a very close vote declaring corporations persons. I think each of us retains the ethical responsibility and the right to say, whoa, wait a minute. What an arbitrary number of 9 people declare isn't going to decide for me what shall count as persons. I shall continue to consult myself, which is my ethical right and my responsibility. So these are legal mechanisms, and we shouldn't confuse them with our own ethical responsibilities to think very carefully and thoughtfully about them for ourselves and continue discussing them going forward. That's how democracy works. This is slow work, and I don't think quick shortcuts really do anything. It's a matter of the heart in the long run, not so much the head. I think the right thing to do here with ethics is that the head should follow the heart rather than the other way around. Looking for quick intellectual shortcuts, I think just provokes uh, just wasting time, frankly, with abstractions that don't really teach the heart anything. I think moral compassion is far more important than legalistic arguments.
So this comment just came in. So why does the humanist seem to cling to the ideas like the sanctity of life? Clearly, clearly, unborn babies and animals don't mind being dead. They wouldn't mind suffering, but not being dead. They would mind suffering, but not being dead.
Well, I won't mind being dead either.
So
Right? I'm an atheist, and death is a state of nothingness that won't bother me. So while being dead, I won't be bothered by it, and I presume that's the same for animals. Of course, dying, nobody likes and would love to postpone. And I think here we rely on our moral compassion to want to make sure that the lives that we do have are enjoyable and free from as much suffering as possible. We can't make everybody's life pleasant. Hardships and troubles are a part of life as much as anything else. But I think we do have an ethical responsibility to at least making worse things that don't need to be so bad. We do have obligations to non human animals, certainly. We don't have the right to treat them however we want to. And we know this because we can perceive with our hearts, perhaps even better than our heads, that animals can enjoy life. They can enjoy life in the moment and as passionately and as exuberantly as any human being. In a way, human beings have it worse. We know it will end, and we regret this. Animals do have some sense of death, perhaps, certainly higher animals do, elephants, perhaps, dolphins, primates. Uh, but I think this means that we sense together that life is special and there's no need to make a hell on earth, um, you know, regardless of whether or not we worry about a hell during an afterlife. Ethical responsibilities come first, and I think we need to listen to our hearts to tell us where we need to go.
very good, very good. Well, we're looks like we're right about to run out of time, so I figured I can turn it back over to you for some closing comments, or you can spend the last minute telling everybody why you hate chimpanzees so much. Your choice.
Oh, I love chimpanzees. I've always known, I don't know, call it intuition or just a heartfelt moral compass that animal cruelty is just unacceptable. And I've always been in favor of the strongest social and legal protections, um, consistent with, trying, we're It's a tough balance between human welfare and animal welfare. There's no easy answers, but certainly we have no right to just blindly and unthinkingly destroy things that weren't put here on this earth for us to destroy by evolution or by a god. Wherever you stand on that question, there's nothing so special about Homo sapiens, as far as we ought to be able to tell objectively, that would give us the right to just terrorize and destroy things that can enjoy lives for themselves. And I just knew this by intuition. I have always enjoyed nature programs and so forth and so on. So efforts to paint those like me who aren't quite ready to assign personhood all over the place. It's not that we don't want to protect animals. We do. But we have to do it carefully because there are pitfalls and there are minefields. And anything so serious deserves our most careful ethical reflection. I don't believe in shortcuts in general, and I don't believe in shortcuts in ethics or in law either. So I hope my audience tonight has been inspired to think a little bit more about this. Maybe you've heard a few things you hadn't thought about, a couple of angles, a couple of arguments you might want to try out with friends. And that's why humanism matters. And that's the name of our show. So I'm going to wrap it up for tonight. This is John Shook, and I'm very proud to have this show with the New Covenant Group, where we try to increase moral compassion along with smart intellectual debate. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sean. And thank everyone for joining us tonight. And good night.
Thank you, Dr. Shook. Good night.